The most incredible plane landings. Last month, a plane landed in a cornfield with its engine stalled. People survived only thanks to the skill of the pilots, but this case is not the only one in the history of aviation. Today I will tell you about other incredible plane landings. Compared to them, landing an airplane in corn is nothing. You are on the Cars Show channel. Let's start. Flying over the Atlantic with empty tanks. On August 24, 2001, the Airbus A300 also left Toronto for Lisbon. Of course, before the flight, the aircraft tanks were refueled and with a margin, but at 5 o'clock in the flight, both engines stalled. There was a hole in the fuel line. The fuel just spilled into the ocean. The pilots noticed the problem in time and decided to make an emergency landing. The nearest airfield was in the Azores. Before he remained 217 kilometers. The pilots turned down to the Azores, but at that time the fuel in the right tank ran out. The right engine stalled, and after 13 minutes the left one also got up. There were 120 kilometers to the base, and the liner began to lose altitude. The pilots showed the highest aerobatic skills and managed to fly to the islands. By the time landing began, the fuel had completely run out. When landing, the wheels of the liner could not withstand the load. At the time of landing they began to fall apart. Staggering and falling apart, the plane swept along the runway and finally slowed down. By the time of the stop, the liner had only 2 whole wheels, but the skills of the pilots was incredible. Despite the hard landing, none of the passengers were injured. Clumsy pilot. Everything started great. On November 22, 1978, a brand new Douglas DC-8-262 flew from Tokyo to San Francisco. True, a problem was discovered before the flight. The altitude meters of the commander and co-pilot showed different altitudes, but the mechanics quickly fixed everything and the plane took off. From Japan to America, the ship reached without incident, but trouble began in San Francisco. It turned out that the airport was closed by thick fog, which means that we had to land on instruments. This is where the commander of the ship noticed that the main and backup altimeters show different heights. It turned out that the mechanics did not fix anything. That's just how it was possible to fly across the ocean and not notice that the instruments were buggy. Did the pilots not look at the panel at all? But it was too late to grab his head. The plane was already descending at a speed of 300 km per hour. The crew tried to connect the automatic landing system and failed again. It turned out that the pilots do not know how to do this. Neither the captain nor the co-pilot had even flown a Douglas of this model before. They had no idea how to insist on emergency automation. As a result, they landed at random and of course they made a mistake. Under the screams, "Too low, low, we rise, we rise!" the pilots landed Douglas at the side of the bay in San Francisco. Luckily the place turned out to be a good one. The plane ran aground, its landing gear rested on the bottom, and the hull remained above the water. Passengers got off with a fright. During the investigation, the commander was asked how it was possible to miss the runway by as much as 4 kilometers and dip the plane into the bay. "I just screwed up," the chief pilot answered. Hurried to the holiday, almost crashed the plane. This is not a joke. The pilots were really in such a hurry that they almost ruined the plane. On December 31st, 1988, the Tu-134 aircraft literally dived towards the runway. The ground was rapidly approaching. The alarm was screaming incessantly, but the pilots turned off the annoying automation and continued the maneuver. At a speed of 460 km per hour, they began to prepare for landing. The flaps could not be released. They were afraid that they would be blown by the wind. But they released the landing gear, despite the fact that the instruction directly prohibits landing at speeds above 330 km per hour. The chassis is not designed for such a monstrous load. Their wheels fall off, but the crew didn't care about the instructions. They were in a hurry. At a speed of 415 km per hour, the liner touched the ground. Incredibly, the chassis survived. The plane overshot the runway, drove past the safety strip and almost skidded to the ground. The liner was separated from the long grass by only 1.5 meters. By the way, this is an absolute record for high-speed landing among liners. Even supersonic records during landing slow down to 330 km per hour. Landing in the Pacific. On the night of October 16, 1956, a Boeing 377 flew from Honolulu to San Francisco. As the plane gained altitude, the pilots reduced their engine power, but one of the engines suddenly increased speed. The team didn't understand what was happening. They did everything to pacify the rebellious engines. The pilots cut off the oil supply, closed the throttle, reduced fuel enrichment. As a result, the engine stalled, but the propeller in auto-rotation mode began to rotate even faster. Frontal air resistance has increased. This led to excessive fuel consumption. The plane began to lose altitude and speed. The team realized that they would have to land on the water, right in the open ocean. And it was at night. For 1956 the situation was terrible. Then the pilots didn't know how to land on the water. All attempts to splash down ended tragically. In those days, planes sank along with passengers and crew, so the pilots were terrified. Flight attendants began to prepare passengers for an emergency landing. People were given life jackets and advised to take off their shoes, so it is easier to stay in the water. To avoid accidental injury, all passengers removed sharp objects from their pockets and removed their glasses. Hawaii Boeing is incredibly lucky. Not far from the liner there were two ships. Their crews did everything to help the aircraft. The sailors laid out a landing path of lights on the water and began to signal false flares, and the plane splashed down. The first touch was smooth, but then the left wing dug into the water and the liner spun. The aircraft's tail fell off from overload. People in the cabin flew out of their seats. Incredibly, no one was seriously injured. All Boeing passengers left the plane on their own and boarded boats. They made it right at the last minute. In just 3 minutes, the huge liner sank. But the passengers were already safe. They were taken to the ships waiting nearby. It was the first splashdown in history in which no one was hurt. Gimli Glider. On July 23, 1983, a Boeing took off from Montreal, of course with full tanks. But soon an alarm sounded. Automation warned that the fuel in the left engine was running out. The pilots consulted the onboard computer. Everything was okay. There is enough fuel and with a margin. The team concluded that the problem was in the fuel pump and it was turned off. Yes, this is quite possible. In this Boeing model, the tanks are located above the engines, so the fuel can flow by gravity. But it didn't help. Soon the alarm on the right engine went off, and then both engines went out, and with them the generators. Much of the Boeing's power grid went down. Only devices powered by the emergency turbine worked. But they were sorely lacking. The plane would not have made it to the nearest airport, but the team was lucky. It turned out that the captain often flew gliders. He knew how to fly aircraft without engines, and the co-pilot served in the Air Force. He suggested that there was an old Gimli military airfield nearby, so you can sit there. You don't have to drive to the airport, and the team sent the Boeing to the airbase. The liner went to the land. The speed and altitude were too high and the commander performed a gliding on the wing. This is how glider pilots slow down before landing. No one has ever performed this maneuver on a Boeing before. Unbelievable, but the team did it. They landed the plane exactly on the runway and almost drove into the frightened crowd. It turned out that the Gimli Air Base had been closed for a long time. The empty premises were transferred to the Auto Club, and the runways were converted into tracks. Races were just being held at an abandoned base. Club members and fans gathered there. When the huge Boeing slowed down, only 30 meters remained before the people. But why were the liner's tanks empty? It's all about reform. In 1983, Canada switched to the metric system and tankers out of habit confused the formulas. It was necessary to calculate the amount of fuel in kilograms, and they use pounds, which as you know are 4 times lighter. Thank you all for watching. The Carl Show team was with you. Don't forget to press the like button and subscribe to our channel. See you soon.